Hey guys, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys are staying in and staying safe because that's like super important at this point in time. I also hope that you guys are using this time effectively to better your prep for this upcoming CLAT exam, which is now on the 21st of June. Today, what we shall be doing is that we're going to be taking a look at the legal section from the latest sample paper that's been provided to us by CLAT. Of course, it's extremely advisable that you guys at least go through it once before viewing this analysis video. So let's get to it straight away. If you guys can start referring to it. Question number 13 is where the legal section starts. I'll be reading it, reading the passage out, then we'll be reading the questions and the options and then discussing why is it that we're choosing one particular option, right, as our answer. So question number 13, it reads as follows. The government passes a law that prohibits the production, manufacture, import, export, transport, sale, commercial distribution and advertisement of e-cigarettes in India. Any person who violates this law will be punishable with imprisonment of up to 1 year or a fine of up to 1 lakh rupees or both. The law states that for any subsequent offence, the person will be punishable with imprisonment of up to 3 years along with a fine of up to 5 lakh rupees. The law defines electronic cigarettes, that is e-cigarettes, as electronic devices that heat a substance, natural or artificial, to create aerosol for inhalation. These e-cigarettes may contain nicotine and flavors, include all form of electronic nicotine delivery systems, heat non-burn products, e-hookahs and other similar devices. However, the definition of e-cigarettes creates an exception for licensed medical products. The law further states that no person is allowed to use any place for the storage of any stock of e-cigarettes. The law states that from the date on which the law came into force, that is September 18, 2019, the commercial owners of existing stocks of e-cigarettes are required to declare and deposit all their stocks at the nearest office of an authorized police officer, at least at the level of a sub-inspector, without unreasonable delay. Now, Khalifa owned a shop known as Big Mali Shop in Kodbangla, Bangalore, that imported and stocked e-cigarettes from China. He had placed an order for e-cigarettes on September 10, 2019 with his Chinese supplier, and the package arrived on September 25, 2019. On the arrival of his package, he promptly went to the house of his neighbor, who happened to be a police inspector, and handed it over to him. On September 27, 2019, he gave away for free 3 e-cigarettes from his existing stock to his cousin Shanti, who was a chain smoker of cigarettes and was exploring alternatives to cigarettes. Shanti was delighted and immediately began using the e-cigarettes. Even after the law came into force, Khalifa continued to stock a product in his shop known as the Double Barrel for sale, which has a chamber that converts nicotine juice into aerosol form like e-cigarettes and a pipe to smoke loose tobacco. Khalifa continues to sell the Double Barrel even after September 18, 2019, right? So that's where we get done with the passage. Now let's get to the questions. 13.1. Did Khalifa obey the law with respect to the new stock of e-cigarettes that arrived on September 25th, 2019? A. Yes, he had already placed an order for the import before the law came into force. B. Yes, he did obey the law because he deposited the stock with a police officer without any unreasonable delay. C. No, he did not deposit it at the office of an authorized police officer. And D is that no, he deposited the stock 7 days after the law came into force. Now guys, the answer here is clearly going to be C. Why is it that the answer is going to be C? Now let's look at what the law said, right? This second last line of the first paragraph of the passage says that commercial owners of existing stock of e-cigarettes are required to declare and deposit all their stocks at the nearest office of an authorized police officer. What has happened in this case, as we can clearly see, is that he's gone. The third line of the second paragraph of this passage says that on the arrival of the package, he promptly went to the house of his neighbor, who happened to be a police inspector. So, I mean, a house is obviously not the nearest office. So, clearly the point here is that he did not obey the law, and the answer here is going to be C. That no, he did not obey the law with respect to the new stock of e-cigarettes that arrived on September 25th, 2019, because he did not deposit it at the office of an authorized police officer, and instead he had deposited it at the house. Now 13.2. Did Khalifa violate the law by giving his e-cigarettes to Shanti? A. No, he did not receive any money for it, and therefore he did not commercially distribute them. No. B. No, No, because an existing stock is not covered by the law. C is that no, three e-cigarettes do not constitute a commercial quantity. And D is that yes, he failed to deposit them at the nearest office of an authorized police officer. Now, what is the answer going to be in this particular case? It's going to be D, because what does the what again, like, go back to the same line, right, that we referred to previously, the first line. It says the last line of the first paragraph. It says that commercial owners of existing stocks of e-cigarettes are required to declare and deposit all their stock, right? So now this particular phrase, all their stock, is inclusive of these three cigarettes, that e-cigarettes that he ended up giving to his cousin Shanti, right? So the answer here, guys, clearly is going to be D, that he has violated the law, D, because he failed to deposit them at the nearest office of an authorized police officer. Answer in this case is going to be D. 13, part 3. Did Shanti violate the law on e-cigarettes by using them? A is that yes, she did not surrender them at the nearest office of an authorized police officer. B is that yes, she conspired with Khalifa to violate the law on e-cigarettes. C is that no, the law does not ban personal use of e-cigarettes. D is that no, she was using it for commercial purposes. No, she was using it. Sorry, I'm so sorry, guys. No, D is that no, she was using it for medical purposes to get off cigarettes. Now, guys, the answer in this is clearly going to be what? It's going to be C, because the law does not ban the personal use of e-cigarettes. Let's have a look at this passage that's been provided to us. Both these paragraphs, at no point through these paragraphs do they say that personal use of e-cigarettes is not allowed. Look at what it says. The first line of the passage itself: passes a law that prohibits the production, manufacture, import, export, transport, sale, commercial distribution, and advertisement of e-cigarettes in India. It does not apply to the consumption, right, of e-cigarettes. This particular law that we are talking about here, right? So as a result, in this case, the answer is going to be C, that no, the law does not ban the personal use of e-cigarettes. 13.4. Is Khalifa stocking of the product double barrel legal? A is that no, it contains the functionality of an e-cigarette. B is that yes, since it also has a pipe for smoking loose tobacco, which is not banned. C is that no, after September 18, 2019, all forms of tobacco delivery system are banned. And D is that yes, because he only stocked it but did not actively sell it. Now understand, guys, that the answer here is going to be A, that it's not legal because it contains the functionality of an e-cigarette, right? What does the law say? The law defines electronic cigarettes, e-cigarettes, as electronic devices that heat a substance, natural or artificial, to create an aerosol for inhalation. Okay, and these ones have been clearly been banned, right, as per the law that has come into play. Now, with respect to this double barrel that Khalifa is talking, right? Look at the last 3 lines of the passage wherein it's stated that Khalifa continued to stock a product in his shop known as the double barrel for sale, which has a chamber that converts nicotine juice into aerosol form like e-cigarettes. So, of course, the functionality of his e-cigarette is clearly there in this double barrel, which is why our answer is going to be A. It's irrespective of the fact that there's also a pipe attached to this double barrel to smoke loose tobacco. But the point remains that at the end of the day, there is this particular chamber which converts nicotine juice into aerosol form like an e-cigarette. And that's where the functionality of e-cigarette comes in. And this is something that is clearly banned, right? Because look at what it says. It includes all forms of electronic nicotine delivery systems, right? And this clearly falls within that. So yeah, the answer to that is going to be A. Now, the 5th part, which is the last question for the first set of questions that have been given here. In the year 2020, Khalifa stocks a type of electronic device under the name Vaporfy. This device can convert a substance into the aerosol form for inhalation through heating, but it's made for use with the juice of a little-known herb called Damiana, which is not legal and is said to have a range of medical benefits for users, such as curing impotency, depression, headaches. Khalifa also stocks the herb Damiana in his shop, is he guilty of violating the law? A is that no, the definition of e-cigarettes does not include medical products. B is that no, Vaporfy is not meant for use with nicotine. C is that no, Damiana is a legal herb. And D is that yes, since Vaporfy can perform the function of an e-cigarette, right? So now, guys, what is now? If we look at the definition of an e-cigarette, it says that the law defines e-cigarettes as electronic devices that heat a substance which is either natural or artificial to create aerosol for inhalation. This is what the definition of an e-cigarette is, right? Now, which is exactly what is happening in this case. That this device, look at what it says, Vaporfy can convert a substance into aerosol form for inhalation through heating, but it's made for use with the use of a juice of a little known herb called Damiana. But that part is like, let's set that part aside. Look at the first part of the sentence where it says that the device can convert a substance into the aerosol form for inhalation through heating, right? Which is exactly what the functionality of an e-cigarette is, which is why the answer in this case is going to be D, that yes, since Vaporfy can perform the function of an e-cigarette, he is guilty of violating the law. So now let's quickly, I'll just quickly rehash the answers. 13 part 1 was C, 13 part 2 was D, 13 part 3 was C, 13 part 4 was A, and 13 part 5 was D. Okay, now guys, let's move on to the next question, which is question number 14. In view of the COVID-19 pandemic, the much forgotten force majeure clause will now come under great scrutiny. A force majeure clause excuses a party to a contract from having to perform its obligation under the contract even if the event described in the force majeure clause occur. The term force majeure appeared in the common law world in the 1900s and was borrowed from the Napoleonic Code, although its origins can be traced back to Roman law. Roman law recognized that the principle of sanctity of contract can be tempered by competing principle that obligations under a contract are binding only as long as matters remain the same as they were at the time of entry into the contract. Under Indian law, force majeure does not simply mean anything outside the control of the parties to a contract. Its meaning and applicability depends on that particular contract and the particular wording that has been used, right? So it is a contractual language intended to anticipate unforeseen events and provide for what happens on their occurrence. Force majeure clauses vary. They can be specific, that is a list of specific events that are treated as being force majeure, such as fire, flood, war, or similar, or general, which is referring simply to events outside the reasonable control of a party to the contract, or a combination of both. Now, the test for seeking to rely on a force majeure clause is number one, that the event that gave rise to a party's non-performance under the contract falls within the definition of force majeure in the contract. That is, the event is covered by the force majeure clause and the non-performance was caused by the relevant event. Two is that the event and the non-performance were due to circumstances beyond a party's control. Therefore, force majeure will not include economic problems like insufficient funds. And the third one is that there was no reasonable steps that could have been taken to avoid or mitigate the event or its occurrences. Now, the last bit of this passage, that the party seeking to rely on the clause must also show that it was not aware at the time of entering the contract that the circumstances giving rise to the event of force majeure were likely to occur. For example, now that the COVID-19 pandemic has started, if parties enter into a contract after this point and then have problems performing as a result, they may not be able to rely on force majeure unless the contract specifically covers COVID-19 and its consequences and provides for what happens if it affects the performance of the contract, right? So guys, now that we are clear on what this passage is talking about, let's look at the questions. 14.1. Okay. Rohan is a freelance writer who writes marketing material for various customers. He usually works from home but travels to a customers' offices on occasion to negotiate a new contract. On March 15, 2020, Rohan executed a contract with a customer under which he promised to deliver 50 pages of marketing material to the customer by March 31st, 2020. Okay. Now the contract provided the following as force majeure events which would excuse a party from performing its obligations under the contract, which is fire, flood, or civil commotion. On March 24th, 2020, the Government of India announced a 3-week lockdown in view of the COVID-19 pandemic, prohibiting people from leaving their homes other than to obtain essentials. Rohan wishes to use the force majeure clause in the contract to avoid delivering the marketing materials to his customer. Can he do so? Right? So now option number A says that yes, since this was an extraordinary event and no person can be held responsible for contractual duties under such circumstances. B is that no, since freelancers cannot claim the protection of a contractual term. C is that no, since pandemics are not covered in the force majeure clause of the contract, and neither was Rohan's ability to do this work affected by the pandemic. And then D is that yes, since Rohan was unable to leave his home for 3 weeks and so could not do the work under the contract. Now guys, the answer for this is clearly going to be C, right? He cannot do so since, pandemics are not covered in the force majeure clause of the contract, and neither was his ability to do his work affected by the pandemic, right? So now let's look clearly at the test, right? There's a test that's been provided in the passage which says that the event that gave rise to a party's non-performance under the contract falls within the definition of force majeure in the contract. So now this that is that the event is covered by the force majeure contract and the non-performance was caused by the relevant event. Now it's written here clearly that a pandemic is something that is not covered in the force majeure of the contract. We know what's his obligation being clearly written out, which probably excuse him from performing the obligations: fire, flood, or civil commotion, right? And the fact that now if you look at the second one second guys, yeah guys, and now if we have to look at the second part, right, of the first of test number 1, which says that and the non-performance was caused by the relevant event. Now it's pretty clear here that Rohan, if you look at the facts that have been provided here, Rohan's a freelance writer. He usually works from home and he only but he travels to customers' offices on occasion to negotiate a new contract. So at no point has his work been affected by the relevant event, which is in this case for him a pandemic, right? So the non-performance was caused by a relevant event, which is not the case in this particular circumstances, right? So the answer clearly in this is going to be C, that firstly that pandemics are not covered in the force majeure clause of the contract, and neither was his ability to do his work affected by the pandemic because he is largely working from home, right? And he only steps out and goes to clients' offices to negotiate a contract, which is not what was happening in this particular case. Now 14.2, Rohan speaks with his customer who agrees to extend the date for submitting the marketing material to April 15, 2020, since Rohan also has to do a lot of housework in light of the lockdown. On April 3rd, 2020, Rohan fell asleep while smoking in bed. The cigarette fell from his hand as he was smoking and set his apartment on fire, but luckily Rohan has escaped without any injuries. Can Rohan now use force majeure clause in the contract to avoid delivering the marketing material to his customer? Okay, now guys, options here are A, yes, since fire is covered in the force majeure clause in the contract. B is that yes, since Rohan's apartment burned down and he could not work there anymore. C is that no, since smoking is a social evil and should not be tolerated. And D is that no, since the fire was caused by Rohan's negligence and not something outside of his control, or what's written here, beyond his control. Now guys, in this case the answer is clearly going to be D, right? So now if we look at the tests again, right? The second test, which clearly states that the event and the non-performance are due to circumstances beyond a party's control. Now this part obviously has not been satisfied here. What has happened here is that this fellow was lying in his bed, he was smoking a cigarette, and he fell asleep, right? So this entire act of him falling asleep and the cigarette falling from his hand as he was smoking and setting his apartment on fire was something that was definitely within his control, right? Within his hands, and he could have prevented this from happening, which is not something that has happened clearly in this case, right? So the answer, guys, here is clearly going to be D, that no, since the fire was caused by Rohan's negligence and not something beyond his control. Now coming to the third one, right? That Rohan finally delivers the marketing material to his customer, Seth Ghanshyam Das, on April 15, 2020. Seth Ghanshyam Das, however, states that he cannot pay Rohan since he has lost all his money, which he has kept as cash in a desk drawer at his house. The desk was placed in a corner of a room and the ceiling above had been leaking water over the past couple of years. Thinking of it as a small matter, however, Seth Ghanshyam Das did not move the desk or keep the money elsewhere. During the lockdown, however, the ceiling finally gave way and the water tank of Seth Ghanshyam Das's building, which was right above, collapsed and flooded his house. He now claims that Mr. Ghanshyam Das now claims that he's not bound to pay as the force majeure clause in the contract protects him. Is he correct? Option number A is that no, since he did not do anything to avoid the loss of the money despite knowing that the ceiling above was leaking for the past couple of years. B is that no, he should not have kept all his money in the form of cash, that too at his place, at his house. C is that no, C is yes, since his house was flooded and the flood was covered in the force majeure clause of the contract. D is that yes, since there was nothing Seth Ghanshyam Das could do to prevent the water tank from collapsing once the ceiling gave way. Now guys, again in this case the answer again is going to be A, that no, since he did not do anything to avoid the loss of the money despite knowing that the ceiling above was leaking for the past couple of years. Now again, if you have to look at the test, if you look at the third one, which clearly states that there was no reasonable step in order for me to like successfully rely on a force majeure clause, I need to show that there were no reasonable steps that could have been taken in order to avoid or mitigate the event or its consequences. In this case, I mean, the facts clearly say that this possibility of the thing falling in was something that could have been anticipated. It's written here that the ceiling above had been leaking water past couple of years, but this fellow had just, Mr. Ghanshyam Das, had just dismissed it as a small matter whatsoever. So it goes on to show that he could have done something about it to ensure that the ceiling did not cave in and the flooding did not take place, but he did not, which is exactly what A says, that he did not do anything to avoid the loss of the money despite knowing that the ceiling above was leaking for the past couple of years. The test has clearly not been satisfied in this particular case. Now guys, coming to 14 part 4, which is Seth Ghanshyam Das entered into agreement with his customer on March 1st, under which he agreed to provide certain electronic goods to his customer's factory by March 15, 2020. The force majeure events described in the contract listed fire, flood, pandemic, war, terror attack, and civil commotion. On March 25th, 2020, Seth Ghanshyam Das called up his customer and told him that he would not be able to deliver the goods due to the lockdown and claims protection under the force majeure clause of the contract. Can he do so? A is that yes, since pandemics are covered in the force majeure clause of the contract. B is that yes, since the lockdown and Seth Ghanshyam Das' inability to deliver the goods were beyond his control. C is that no, since electronic goods are essential items and Seth Ghanshyam Das should have delivered them even during the lockdown. And D is that no, since the lockdown had been declared after the date for delivery of the goods under the contract had passed. Okay, so now guys, the answer in this case is going to be D. Why is it going to be D? Now let's look at this. Agreement has been entered into on the 1st of March 2020, wherein he had said that he is going to provide those goods to his customer's factory by March 15, 2020. Right? Now, when has the lockdown come into play? Now guys, if we refer, I mean, since this is a continuation, and in 14.1 it was written that on March 24, 2020, the government of India announced a 3-week lockdown. So the lockdown announced on March 24th, 2020, right? And so what has happened in, yeah guys, so what has happened in this case, right? The lockdown is announced on 24th of March. This guy has entered into a contract with his customer on March 1st, and he says that goods are going to be declared by March 15th, right? So the answer clearly in this case is going to be D, as I said, because the lockdown is declared after the date for delivery of the goods under the contract had passed. Now, for example, in this particular case, if the date for delivery was March 29th, then in light of that, probably he could have been able to claim some sort of he could have claimed protection under the force majeure clause, because if the clause states pandemic, right? But in this case, what has happened is that the delivery was stated to be on March 15, 2020, and he has not, I mean, it should have already been delivered, right? He should not have had to wait till March 25th to say that, oh shit, I'm not going to be able to deliver it due to the lockdown, right? And hence claim protection. He cannot claim protection in this case. Answer is going to be D. Now, guys, if we look at the next question, which is 14 part 5, once the lockdown was lifted and in the wake of COVID-19 crisis, the Government of India announced various measures to help revive society and the economy. A government announcement published in all newspapers on April 30th, 2020 stated that higher taxes on sale of various goods such as electronic and electrical items would be levied on the sellers of such goods to collect money to pay for reconstruction efforts post the COVID-19 crisis. On May 1st, 2020, Sheth Ghanshyam Das entered into a contract with a customer to supply certain electrical goods at a certain price. The contract included flood, tempest, war, earthquake, or events that make the activity under the contract unprofitable as force majeure events. On May 5th, the government announced an additional tax of 30% on the sale of any electrical goods to be paid by the seller of such goods. Under these circumstances, Sheth Ghanshyam Das would have suffered a loss by selling the goods since his profit margin was only 20%, right? Can he use the force majeure clause in the contract to avoid selling the goods to his customer? Now, what are the options? A is that no, since the imposition of higher taxes was not covered in the contract. B is that no, since Sheth Ghanshyam Das was aware that higher taxes on sale of electrical goods could be levied when he entered into the contract. C is that no, since the levy of additional tax was a matter within Mr. Sheth Ghanshyam Das's control. And D is that no, since Sheth Ghanshyam Das could have taken steps to increase the price of the goods even after entering into the contract. Now, guys, the answer in this case is going to be B, which reads that no, since Sheth Ghanshyam Das was aware that higher taxes on sale of electrical goods could be levied when he entered into the contract. Now, guys, see this. It clearly states here that on April 30th, the government has made this announcement saying that higher taxes on sale of various goods such as electronic and electrical goods would be levied on sellers of such goods to collect money for the reconstruction efforts post COVID-19. This is on April 30th. He has entered into this contract to like sell his electrical goods to a particular customer at a certain price on May 1st, which is the next day, right? I'm not, one second. Yeah, it is the next day. So now what has happened is that why is that the answer is going to be B? If we look, guys, again at the passage and look at this bit right after the test, wherein it states that the party seeking to rely on the clause must also show that it was not aware at the time of entering the contract that the circumstances giving rise to the event of force majeure were likely to occur. In this case, he is very much aware because, it has been published in the newspapers the day before he has entered into the contract. So in this case, guys, the answer is going to be B. So now looking at just to quickly summarize what the answers were. 14 part 1 was C, 14 part 2 was D, 14 part 3 was A, 14 part 4 was D, and 14 part 5 was B. Now, guys, that brings us to question number 15. In this passage, we explain what behavior amounts to sexual harassment and how victims of sexual harassment in workplaces can use legal recourse for relief. A 2018 survey by the Indian National Bar Association revealed that 68% of victims of sexual harassment at the workplace don't report such incidents, fearing adverse consequences at the workplace. And while cases of cyber sexual abuse are rampant, there aren't any official stats available to reflect the gravity of the situation. This is the story even though there's a specific law, that is the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, that's meant to give a voice to sexual harassment victims. So how can women better use these provisions against the perpetrators of sexual harassment? Advocate Vandana Shah shares some insights. Egregious behavior like assault and eve teasing clearly amount to sexual harassment, but off-color jokes, obscene WhatsApp forwards, personal remarks in describing a woman in anatomical terms, verbal abuse in regular social interactions, all forms of sexual harassment. Shah said that if a joke makes a woman highly uncomfortable, she is entitled to go and register a complaint with the Internals Complaint Committee, that is the ICC of the organization. Under the law, every organization with 10 or more employees needs to set up an ICC. It must be presided over by a senior female employee of the organization, and at least one half of the members of the ICC must be women, including an external member who is preferably familiar with the law or associated with a non-profit organization working for the causes of women. Now, the law entitles a victim to lodge a complaint with the ICC, which is supposed to keep it confidential. This is followed by an issue of notice to the respondent within 7 days of receipt of the complaint. The accused gets 10 working days to submit his reply along with list of witnesses and documents. Thereafter, the committee is supposed to hear the victim, the individual against whom the complaint has been filed, and the witnesses, and present a report. During the investigation, the ICC can recommend that the organization provide certain reliefs like transfer of the aggrieved woman or of the respondent, or granting the aggrieved woman leave. Shah pointed out that aggrieved woman and the respondent have a right to cross-examine all witnesses in the form of written question and responses, but only via the ICC. The working rules of the ICC must state the respondent shall have no right to directly cross-examine the victim or her witnesses. Guys, this is of course a super important thing that one must remember as we enter law school and get into the workspace is something that's really important, and something that has to be looked at with with very keen eyes, right? But now coming to the questions that have been discussed here. 15 part 1. 1 second guys, I'll just look at my notes. Yes, 15 part 1. Preeta and Rajesh work at a company called Free Cloud Enterprises. Rajesh is Preeta's senior at work, and Preeta has to report to Rajesh every day about her work. One day, Rajesh sent Preeta a set of images on WhatsApp. These images were lewd and obscene in nature, and Preeta was offended by them. She wishes to file a complaint of sexual harassment against Rajesh. Is Rajesh guilty of sexual harassment? A is that yes, since Preeta reported to him at work and it was his responsibility to ensure that she was comfortable at the workplace. B is that no, since she had only sent images once and there is no evidence to suggest that he did such things habitually. C is that yes, since sending obscene WhatsApp messages to a woman colleague amounts to sexual harassment at the workplace. And D is that no, since Rajesh is only meant to send Preeta the images as a joke. Guys, clearly in this case the answer is going to be C. If we look at the passage here wherein it is discussed, it says here what Mrs. Advocate Vandana Shah clearly states it here. Egregious behavior like assault and eve-teasing clearly of course amounts to sexual harassment, but off-color jokes, obscene WhatsApp forwards, personal remarks describing a woman in anatomical terms, verbal abuse and regular social interactions are also all forms of sexual harassment, right? So clearly this, if this person has sent these WhatsApp images which are lewd and obscene in nature, and Preeta has been offended by him, she has every right to file a complaint, which is why the answer in this case is going to be C. Yes, in sending obscene WhatsApp messages to a woman colleague amounts to sexual harassment at the workplace. Right, 15 part 2. Free Cloud Enterprises has 11 employees. Since the matter of employees is low, the CEO of Free Cloud Enterprises, Dinesh, decides not to form an ICC. When Preeta approached Dinesh with a complaint, Dinesh told her he would handle the matter himself rather than establishing an ICC. Can he do so? Yes. A is that yes, it would be more effective if Dinesh handled the matter himself as he was the CEO of the company. B is that no, since the law requires all organizations 10 or more people to set up an ICC. C is that yes, since the company had only 11 employees, of whom Dinesh and Preeta were 2, as such there were effectively only 9 employees in the company, and Dinesh does not need to establish an ICC. D is that no, since any woman employee can demand the establishment of an ICC in any organization, no matter how many employees it may have. Now guys, this is extremely crystal clear. It says here that Free Cloud Enterprises has 11 employees. The law on the matter clearly states here, if we are to look at it, Under the law, every organization with 10 or more employees needs to set up an ICC. It is extremely clear. In this case, it has 11 employees. FreeCloud Enterprises has to set up an ICC. In this case, answer is going to be B. He cannot say that he's going to handle the matter himself rather than establishing an ICC. He cannot do this whatsoever. Why is this so? Answer is going to be B clearly, because the law requires all organizations 10 or more employees to set up an ICC. In this case, we had 11 employees. Clear answer is going to be B. Now 15 part 3, which reads that Dinesh agrees to establish the ICC for FreeCloud Enterprises and to refer Preeta's complaint to the ICC. Aside from Preeta, who's a middle-level employee at FreeCloud Enterprises, 2 other women worked at the company. Ranjita, who's a new employee, was hired at a junior position. Sunita was a director and therefore held a senior position in the company. Dinesh appoints Ranjita and Sunita to the ICC, but not Preeta. He also decides to be a member of the ICC and to preside over the committee himself, as he is the CEO of the company. Can he preside over the ICC? A is that yes, since he is the senior most employee of the company and as such should preside over its ICC. B is that yes, since this would ensure that the decision of the ICC are implemented. C is that no, since Dinesh was involved in the matter himself. And D is that no, since the ICC must be presided over by a woman. Now again, here guys, the answer is clearly going to be D. If we are to read the passage thoroughly, it clearly says that the ICC must be presided over by a senior female employee of the organization, right? So it's clearly written here within the law itself that the ICC has to be presided over by a senior female employee of the organization. Needless to say that Dinesh here is not a female employee. He cannot be the chair of the ICC. Answer is going to be D. No, since ICC must be presided over by a woman, and Dinesh is not a woman in this case. Now 15.4. If FreeCloud Enterprises ICC is to have a total of 5 members, how many other men can Dinesh appoint to the ICC? A, none. B, 1. C, 2. And D, 3. Now guys, understand here that, what does it say? That at least half of them have to be women, right? So if there are if it's to have a total of 5 members, then half of that is 2.5. So that ensures that there have to be at least 3 women, right? So that leaves us with 2 men, one of which is Dinesh. How do we know this? Because this is where the question is being a little tricky, possibly. It says how many other men can Dinesh appoint to the ICC. So I'm guessing the word other means that Dinesh has already appointed himself to the ICC. So that leaves us with 1 other per man can be appointed to the ICC, which is why the answer is going to be B, which is 1. I hope everyone's clear as to why there will be 3 women, right? It's 2.5, so of course that's not how it works. So it's going to be rounded to 3. It cannot be 2. We cannot have lesser women than men in this ICC. That's not something that's not what the law is talking about. It has to be at least half. So for example, if there were 16 members in the ICC, they would have to have at least 8, right? That's a minimum, half of his minimum. So 2.5 is minimum, and of course you cannot have 2.5 women, so that translates automatically to 3 women, right? So that's which is why 3 of them plus Dinesh and 1 more person, 1 more man, which is why the answer is going to be B. 15 part 5, guys. The ICC of FreeCloud Enterprises conducts its investigation to Preeta's complaint and finds Rajesh guilty of sexual harassment. It recommends to the company that it grant Preeta her request of transferring Rajesh to a branch office of the company. Preeta also asked the ICC to recommend that Rajesh be sent on leave for 2 weeks. Can the ICC grant this request? Guys, now what do the options read? No. A is that no, since ICC can recommend the transfer of Preeta or Rajesh and recommend that Preeta be granted leave, but cannot recommend that Rajesh be sent on leave. B is that no, since Rajesh was Preeta's senior at the workplace. C is that yes, since ICC found Rajesh guilty of sexual harassment. And D is that yes, it would have been traumatic for Preeta to see Rajesh at the workplace. Now, guys, I mean, this is follows from what the law clearly states. Answer is going to be A, right? Why is it that the answer is going to be A, which reads as no, since they cannot grant Preeta this particular request of hers, since the ICC can recommend her transfer or Rajesh's transfer and can recommend that Preeta be granted leave, but it cannot recommend that Rajesh be sent on leave. So, I mean, if we look at if we look, guys, at the paragraph, at the passage above, it clearly is written that, yeah, so it's clearly been written here, guys. If we look at the last paragraph within this passage here, it says the law entitled the victim, to lodge a complaint with the ICC, which is supposed to keep it confidential. This is followed by the issuance. Okay, I'm so sorry, guys. I read the wrong paragraph. If that was the second last paragraph. If we look at the last paragraph, it says here, during the investigation, the ICC can recommend that the organization provide certain reliefs, like transfer of the aggrieved woman, which in this case is going to be her, or of the respondent. So the transfer is something that is allowed of both the parties, or granting the aggrieved woman leave. It says at no point does it say that, that it can recommend that the perpetrator in this case, which is Rajesh, be granted leave, right? That's not within the recommendatory powers of the ICC, as a result of which the ICC cannot do that. The answer, guys, in this is clearly going to be A. Now, coming to question number 16. Okay, guys, so let's read this passage. The Reserve Bank of India, which is the RBI, has powers to regulate banks, but those do not include the power to prohibit or ban virtual currencies or VCs directly. However, the RBI issues directions to banks that they should not provide banking services to those engaged in the trading of VCs or engaged in the facilitation of such trading by operating VC exchanges and so on. The Supreme Court of India observed that the concern of RBI ought to be about the entities regulated by it, that is banks. However, the RBI did not take a stand that any of the banks regulated by it had suffered any loss or adverse effect directly or indirectly on account of the interfacing between banks and VC exchange operators. The RBI has very wide powers to take preventive as well as curative measures, but the availability of power is different from the manner and extent to which the power may be exercised. While the Supreme Court recognized the power of the RBI to take preemptive action, it questioned the proportionality of the measures used by the RBI. To determine the proportionality of RBI measures, the Supreme Court held that the RBI should show some semblance of damage suffered by its regulated entities. There should be some empirical data to demonstrate the degree of harm suffered by the regulated entities after establishing that they were harmed to begin with. It's not the case of the RBI that any of the entities regulated by it had suffered on the account of the provision of banking services to the online platforms running VC exchanges. When the consistent stand of the RBI is that they are not banned VCs, and when the government is unable to take a call despite several committees coming with several proposals, including 2 draft bills, both of which advocated exactly opposite positions, it's not possible for the Supreme Court to hold that the impugned measure is proportionate. However, the Supreme Court set aside the RBI's circular containing directions to banks that they should not provide banking services to those engaged in the trading of VCs or engaged in the facilitation of such trading. Now, guys, this has been taken is based on a judgment which has been delivered in IMAI versus Reserve Bank of India. You guys can read up on this on your own accord if you guys want to know more about this, of course. Now, 16 part 1. Which of the following is true? A, that the RBI has banned VCs. B is that the RBI has prohibited companies from facilitated trading in VCs. C, the RBI has prohibited banks from allowing companies engaged in trading in VCs from using banking services. And D is that the RBI has banned those banks that traded in VCs. Guys, the answer is clearly C, that the RBI has prohibited banks from allowing companies engaged in trading in VCs from using banking services, right? Which is what has happened here, that the RBI has issued direction to bank that they should not provide banking services. This is from the first paragraph of the passage. Should not provide banking services to those engaged in the trading of VCs or engaged in the facilitation of such trading by operating VCs, exchanges, and so on. Clearly, straight from the passage, answer is going to be C. 16.2. The Supreme Court took exception to the RBI's actions because A, the RBI had no concern for companies trading in VCs. B is that the RBI had not shown any concern for banks regulated by it. C is that the RBI did not prove that the banks had suffered harm because the provision of banking services to VC exchange operators, but directed banks not to do so anyway. D is that RBI exercised wide powers despite having narrow powers under the law. Guys, again in this, the answer is clearly going to be C, that the RBI has not proved that the banks have suffered any harm because of the provision of providing banking services to VC exchange operators, but have directed banks not to do so anyway, which is exactly what the passage is talking about, right? Wherein it says, where the first part of which clearly reads that the RBI has issued directions to banks that they should not provide. So that part has already happened, that they should not provide banking services to those engaged in the trading of VC. But it also goes on to show that, it also goes on to say subsequently that the Supreme Court of India observed that the concern of RBI ought to be about entities regulated by it, that is banks. However, the RBI nowhere has taken a stance that any of the banks regulated by it has suffered any loss or adverse effect directly or indirectly on account of intersurfacing between the banks and the VC exchange operators. Later on, the Supreme Court also has gone on to say within this passage itself that the RBI has to show some semblance of damage suffered by its regulated entities, banks, for it to, prohibit banks from providing banking services to those companies which are engaged in the trading of VCs, right? So the answer, guys, clearly in this case is going to be C, that they have a problem with this particular directive of the RBI because the RBI has not proved that the banks have suffered any harm because of the provision of banking services to VC exchange operators, but have, regardless of this, directed banks not to provide them with banking services. Now, question number 13, part 3. In an appeal against the judgment of the Supreme Court on which the above passage is based, the RBI demonstrated that a bank had been provided banking services to a VC exchange operator had suffered losses because a company engaged in a real estate project had not repaid a loan that it had borrowed. Will the RBI succeed in its appeal? A is that yes, and the RBI can demonstrate that the banks providing banking services to operators or VC exchanges had suffered harm. B, yes, in the crux of the problem that the RBI found with the RBI stance, that the Supreme Court, found with the RBI stance was that it could not provide any data about any banks that had suffered losses. C is that no, since only one bank has suffered losses after providing banking services to a company operating a VC exchange. And D is that there's no correlation between the loss suffered by the bank and the provision of banking services by that bank to the VC exchange operator. Now, guys, the answer in this is going to be C, right? Clearly, there's no, what does the passage, what does the question say? That RBI demonstrated that the bank had been providing banking services to a VC exchange operator. Now, the bank has suffered losses because a company engaged in real estate projects had not repaid a loan that it had borrowed from the bank, right? There's no correlation whatsoever between the losses suffered by the bank and the provision of banking services by that bank to the VC exchange operator. Now, if we go and see what is it that the paragraph says here, that the passage says here in paragraph 1, that in paragraph 2 rather, that the RBI has to show that a loss has been suffered by the bank on account of interfacing between the bank and the VC exchange operators. This interfacing between the bank and the VC exchange operators on this account, whether loss has happened. In this case, no, it's not happened. In this case, the loss has only happened because of the non-payment of a loan from a company engaged in real estate projects, right? That had been borrowed from this particular bank. There's no correlation whatsoever. Answer in this case is going to be D. Now, 16 part 4. The RBI issues a new circular stating that VCs are being used by a terrorist organization called ISIL and imposes a countrywide ban on the use of VCs until further notice. this new circular challenge between the Supreme Court? Will the Supreme Court uphold its validity? Yeah, A, yes, since the new circular demonstrates valid grounds of banning VCs. B is that the RBI does not have the no, since the RBI does not have the authority to ban VCs. C is that yes, the RBI had taken a clear stance that VCs are being used by terrorist organization, and D is that no, the RBI cannot issue any circular after the Supreme Court order. In this case, guys, the answer is B, that the RBI does not have the authority to ban VCs to begin with, right? What does the passage tell us? That the Reserve Bank of India has power to regulate banks, but does not include the power to prohibit or ban VCs directly, which is exactly what has happened in this particular case. It is something that is not permissible by law, right? As a result, the answer in this is going to be B. 16.5, relying on data gathered by a third-party research outfit showing that construction companies frequently fail to repay loan to banks, the RBI has issued a circular instructing banks to conduct special in-depth due diligence on construction companies before granting them loans. Is this circular valid? A is that no, the RBI cannot regulate construction companies. B is that yes, the RBI can regulate construction companies based on real data that demonstrates harm being caused to banks by construction companies. C is that no, the RBI cannot direct differential treatment of a special type of companies as compared to others, since all companies are equal before the law. And D is that yes, the RBI has powers to issue directions such as in this circular, and the measures that the RBI has instructed banks to take are proportionate to the harm that the banks let me just read this again. D is yes, the RBI has powers to issue directions such as in the circular, and the measure that the RBI instructed banks to take are proportionate to the harms to the bank that is sought to be prevented. Guys, in this clearly the answer is going to be D. What has happened in this case? They said that the RBI has relied on some data which show that construction companies frequently fail to repay loans to banks. So all that the RBI has done here in this case, issued a circular to the banks which says that please conduct special in-depth due diligence on construction companies before offering them loans. Now, guys, coming from what the passage says, it's very clear that the RBI has the power to regulate the functioning of banks, right? Now, with respect to whether or not it's proportionate, the question of proportionality again has been discussed here in the second paragraph of the passage, where it says that while the Supreme Court recognized the power of the RBI to take preemptive action, which is what this effectively is, it questioned the proportionality of the measures used by the RBI. So it says that to determine proportionality of the RBI's measures, Supreme Court has held that the RBI has to show some semblance of damage suffered by its regulated entities, right? There has to be some sort of empirical data to demonstrate the degree of harm suffered by its regulated entities. Now, what has happened in this case clearly flows from that. It says that third-party research third-party research outfit has shown that construction companies are frequently failing to repay loans to banks. So that damage has been shown in this particular case. So the question of proportionality has been settled, right? Because some semblance of damage suffered by banks has been shown by the RBI in this case for it to issue this directive to banks saying that please, have a thorough DD before granting construction companies loans, right? As a result, guys, the answer is clearly going to be D, that the RBI has powers to issue directions such as this in this particular circular, and the measures that the RBI has instructed banks to take are proportionate to the harm to the banks that they're trying to prevent. Very clear cut. Answer is going to be D. Now, 16.6, the IRDAI, which is the India's insurance sector regulator, has wide powers to regulate insurance companies, taking cognizance of the rising death toll in the country due to the coronavirus. The IRDAI has directed banks to issue loans at very low interest to insurance companies so that insurance companies can process insurance claims on time. This direction of the IRDAI is challenged before the Supreme Court. Will the challenge be successful? A is that no, the IRDAI does not have the power to issue directions to banks. B is that no, the IRDAI directions do not benefit insurance companies. Yes, C is that yes, the IRDAI directions ensure that the insurance companies do not face a shortage of funds at a time when the number of claims may be very high. And D is that yes, the IRDAI has taken a proportionate measure in the face of serious threat to the business of insurance companies. Guys, in this case, the answer is going to be A. They don't have, the IRDAI does not have the power to issue directions to banks. It's written that clearly in the question itself that IRDAI, which is India's insurance sector regulator, has wide powers to regulate insurance companies, right? That is the ambit. That's what the ambit of their power is restricted to. Banks are to be regulated by the RBI, right? Answer is going to be A. 16.7. A VC exchange operator called Satoshi Associates borrows a huge loan from a public sector bank and fails to repay the loan to the bank. Taking cognizance of this, the RBI issues instructions to all public sector banks in the country that no loans may be issued to Satoshi Associates. Satoshi Associates challenges these instructions of the RBI in court. Will they succeed? A is that no, the RBI's instructions were issued in the exercise of its powers based on an actual default by Satoshi Associates and in proportion to the harm that would be prevented by such instructions. No. B is that no, VC exchange operation is prohibited in India. C is that no, the RBI can exercise any power available to it under law at any time regardless of other considerations. And D is that yes, the RBI's instructions are regressive and not in the interests of banks or the country's interests at large. Guys, in this case, it's pretty clear. Answer is going to be A. There's this VC exchange operator called Satoshi Associates. They borrowed a huge loan. They failed to repay the loan to that particular public sector bank. In relation to this, RBI has given instructions to all public sector banks that no loans may be issued to Satoshi Associates, right? I mean, proportionality has been shown in this particular case. Semblance of damage has been shown. These are the requirements as been stated in the passage above for the RBI to issue such a directive to banks across the country, right? It's also written that huge loan has been taken and that has been failed to be repaid. It's very clear cut that RBI's instructions have been issued in due exercise of its power because it has the power to regulate the functioning of a particular bank, and it's actually based on actual default by Satoshi Associates and is proportionate to the harms that would be prevented by such instructions, right? They have shown some semblance of damage here clearly, and proportionality has been satisfied. Now, guys, coming to question number 17. Okay, but before that, let me quickly go over the answers for this. 16.1 was C, 16.2 was C, 16.3 was D, 16.4 was B, 16.5 was D, 16.6 was A, and 16.7 was also A. Now, question number 17, guys. The central government has decided to invoke the Epidemics Act of 1897 as the Epidemic Act to tackle the coronavirus crisis. The decision was taken on March 11, 2020. The Epidemic Act is meant to provide for the better prevention of the spread of dangerous epidemic diseases. The central government issued a regulation which is subsequently known to be referred to as the March 11th regulations, prohibiting till March 31st, 2020 the entry into Indian ports of international cruise ships, crew or passengers with a travel history to coronavirus hit nations. Section 2A of the Epidemic Act empowers the central government to take steps to prevent the spread of an epidemic. When the central government is satisfied that India or any part thereof is visited by or threatened with an outbreak of any dangerous epidemic disease, the central government may prescribe regulations for the inspection of any ship or vessel leaving or arriving at any port in the territory of India, and for such detention thereof of any person intending to sail therein or arriving or leaving thereby as may be necessary, it says. Now, guys, please go through this very thoroughly and be able to, and hope to understand this in clear-cut terms, right? Now, the British Era Act was mainly used to control plague in the late 1800s. Its provisions being invoked by the government now call for fines and imprisonment in case of violations. Any person disobeying any regulation or order made under this act shall be deemed to have committed an offence punishable under Section 188 of the Indian Penal Code, says Section 3 of the Epidemic Act. The law also protects officials who act under the provisions of this law. No suit or other legal proceedings shall lie against any person for anything done or in good faith intended to be done under this act, says Section 4 of this legislation. The Epidemic Act can be used to restrict movement of suspected coronavirus patients to prevent further spread of the disease. The need to invoke the act was felt to empower the central government to tackle the outbreak. Right? So now guys, let's come to the question. 17.1. On March 12, 2020, the central government prescribed a set of regulations, which is the March 12th regulations, which requires that any goods vessel trying to enter an Indian port should first be subjected to a thorough inspection by the government health officials at that port. On March 13, 2020, a Russian goods vessel, the Vostok, reached the waters outside Vishakhapatnam and sought permission to dock at the port from the port authorities. The port authorities informed the captain of the Vostok that they had a shortage of health officials at the port and that the Vostok would have to wait 3 days before it could be inspected, and a decision taken on entering the port. Captain Gagarin of the Vostok argues that this amounts to prohibiting the entry of Vostok into an Indian port, and since the prohibition only applied to cruise ships, it was invalid. Is he right? Option number A is that yes, since the Vostok is a goods vessel and not a cruise ship. B is yes, since a delay of 3 days amounts to the same thing as a permanent prohibition on entering the port. C is that no, since the inspection of the Vostok was mandatory under Section 188 of the IPC, and D is that no, since the inspection of the Vostok was mandatory under the March 12th regulations, right? Now, guys, the answer in this is going to be D. Why is it going to be D? Look at what the regulations mentioned within this question and itself state, right? It says that any goods vehicles and trying to enter an Indian port should be first subjected to a thorough inspection by government health officials at that port, and this is a requirement under the set of regulations prescribed by the government on March 12th, 2020, also known as the March 12th regulations, right? So clearly written here that it requires that any goods vessel trying to enter an Indian port should first be subjected to thorough inspection, which is exactly why it has been prevented entry to this particular port at Vizag. It says that it has to wait for 3 days before it can be inspected due to a shortage of health officials, but it does not take away from the fact that a mandatory thorough inspection by government health officials is something that is required under the law, and that is something that cannot happen and has to wait for 3 days, right? So the argument that Mr. Gagarin here, the captain of the Vostok, has given here is not right. Answer is D here. Inspection of the Vostok is mandatory, right, under the March 12th regulations. 17 part 2. On March 16, 2020, a team of health officials from the Vizag port have boarded the Vostok, carried out the inspection. The health officials decided to permit the entry of Vostok into Vizag, but ordered that Captain Gagarin accompany them on their vessel so that he could be put in isolation ward at the local hospital, as he had tested positive for the coronavirus. Could they issue such an order? A, yes, since it's important that persons who tested positive should be isolated in a hospital. B is that yes, since the Epidemic Act permits the restriction of movement of people who test positive for coronavirus. C is that no, since the March 12 regulations only require that good vessels should be inspected prior to being allowed to enter an Indian port and do not talk about detaining people. And D is that no, since Captain Gagarin is not an Indian citizen. Guys, now in this case, the answer is going to be B, that yes, they can issue such an order since the Epidemic Act permits the restriction of movement of people who test positive for coronavirus. Now, guys, if you are to look at the last 2 lines of this passage that has been provided to us, it reads here very clearly that the Epidemic Act can be used to restrict movement of suspected coronavirus patients to prevent further spread of the disease, right? So at no point does this get into nationality and all of that. It says restrict movement of suspected coronavirus patients to prevent further spread of the disease, which is exactly what has happened in this particular case. The captain here has tested positive, and as per in accordance with the Epidemics Act, they can issue such an order. Answer is, guys, going to be in this case B. Now, coming to the third question, on March 23rd, 2020, the Vostok finished unloading all of its goods and sought permission from the Vizag port authorities to leave the port's waters. First Officer Tereshkova of the Vostok had taken the decision to leave the port even though Captain Gagarin was in isolation. The Vizag port authorities refused the Vostok permission to leave. Did they have the authority to do so? A is that yes, they had the authority to do so under the March 12th regulation. B is that yes, they had the authority to do so under 2A of the Epidemic Act. C is that no, they did not have the authority to do so under the March 12th regulation. And D is that no, since Captain Gagarin was still in isolation at the hospital. Now, guys, this is in fact a very interesting question. So the answer in this case is going to be C, that no, they do not have the authority to do so under the March 12th regulations. We know it's in 17 part 1, it's clear cut as to what the March 12th regulations say, right? They say that it requires any goods vessel at trying to enter the Indian port to be subjected to a thorough inspection. That's what the March 12th regulations talk about. With respect to like detaining detaining the ship and not allowing it to leave, people would be, in this case, could have gone, like a lot of people here and probably me myself when I first read it thought that it could have also been B, which is yes, they had authority to do so under 2A of the Epidemic Act. But then if we look at 2A carefully, what is it that 2A says? 2A says that when the central government is satisfied that India or any other part thereof is visited or threatened with an outbreak of any dangerous epidemic act, the central government may prescribe regulations. This is the critical phrase here, for the inspection of any ship or vessel leaving or arriving at any port in the territory of India, and for such detention of any person or thereof, or of any other person intending to sail therein, or arriving or leaving thereby as may be necessary. So having read this last bit, you would be like tempted to like answer B, but understand that 2A says is that the central government can prescribe regulations for this. It does not provide port officials here, the Vizag port authority officials, the right to refuse the Vostok from leaving, right? That is something that, that's not something that's permitted. Under the law, the Vostok port authorities do not have that particular power to do so. Section 2A says that the central government can make some particular regulations for this particular purpose. The regulations that have been made in this case are like the March 12 regulations, which only talks about inspection, does not talk about detention. Guys, clearly the answer in this case is C. They do not have the authority to do so under the March 12 regulation. Now, question number 17.4. Now, when Mr. Captain Gagarin has heard about the Vostok's departure from the Vizag port, he's gotten very angry. That night, he secretly escaped from the hospital. Next morning, however, the police and hospital officials tracked him down, filed charges under Section 118 of the IPC against him. Has he committed an offence under Section 118? No, I'm so sorry, guys. 188 of the IPC against him. Has he committed an offence under Section 188 of the IPC? Option number A, yes, since he violated the isolation order made under the Epidemic Act. B is that no, since he was the captain of the Vostok and was compelled to join its crew. No, since the March 12th regulations applied to good vessels, not to individuals. And D is yes, since the order under March 12th regulations applied to him personally, right? Now, guys, the answer in this case is clearly going to be A, that yes, since he violated the isolation order made under the Epidemic Act. If we look at the penultimate paragraph of this passage, wherein it clearly says, where they discuss Section 3 of the Epidemic Act, wherein it says that any person disobeying any regulation or order made under this act shall be deemed to have committed an offence punishable under Section 188 of the IPC, right? So in this case, an order had been made that he be put in this particular hospital. He has tried to escape from that, and he's subsequently been tracked down, and like charges have been accurately filed against him under Section 188, right? So yes, since he has violated the isolation order made under the Epidemic Act? So as a result, guys, the answer is going to be A. Because remember that this isolation order also comes from the Epidemic Act, wherein it says that, which has been previously discussed only, that the Epidemic Act can be used to restrict movement of suspected coronavirus patients to prevent further spread of the disease. Right. So him being put within isolation is an extension of this, and him subsequently running away from that hospital is violative of this order, as a result of which, guys, the answer in this case is going to be A. Now 15 part 5. Now the cruise ship Sputnik Sweetheart was scheduled to arrive at Vizag port on April 2nd, 2020. On April 1st, 2020, Captain Gagarin was discharged from hospital where he had been kept. As a humanitarian gesture, the authorities dropped all charges against him as well. He therefore decided to buy a ticket to board the Sputnik Sweetheart, as it was destined eventually for his home port of Vladivostok. The Vizag port authorities, however, decided not to permit the Sputnik Sweetheart to enter the port, as it had just arrived from China, a COVID-affected country. Captain Gagarin claimed that they did not have the right to do so. Right? A is that no, since the port authorities had that authority under the March 12th regulation. B is that no, since the port authorities had that authority under the March 11th regulations. C is that yes, since the March 11th regulations only prohibited the entry of such cruise ships until March 31st, 2020. And D, since the port authorities had that power under Section 188 of the ICC. Now, guys, I mean, this can get a little confusing. So please go over what are these two regulations that they're talking about, right? So the March 11th regulation has clearly written here that it prohibits entry into Indian ports of international cruise ships, crew or passengers with a travel history to coronavirus hit countries till March 31st, 2020. So we have banned. So as per the passage, the central government has passed a regulation. The March 11th regulation bans entry of cruise ships only till March 31st, 2020. March 12th regulations, guys, talks about vessel, any goods vessel. So in this case, guys, Sputnik Sweetheart is a cruise ship, and I mean, as per the March 11th regulation, they were like not permitted to enter. They could be prevented from entering an Indian port only till March 31st. Now, what has happened is that this Sputnik Sweetheart is entered, or rather scheduled to enter Vizag port on April 2nd. So the Vizag port authorities, their decision to not permit Sputnik Sweetheart to enter the port goes against the regulations that have been provided. Captain Gagarin in this case is right, because C, the March 11th regulations only prohibited entry of such cruise ships until March 31st, 2020. Now, guys, that brings an end to like question number 17. Now we have two more to go, which is 18 and 19. Now, question number 18. Now, the Supreme Court on March 17, 2020 granted eligibility for grant a permanent commission for women officers in the Navy, saying that women can sail with same efficiency as male officers and there should be no discrimination. The application for permanent commission shall be considered based on the availability of vacancies and the recommendations of the naval staff, the court has said. A permanent commission entitles an officer to serve in the Navy till he or she retires, unlike short service commission, which is currently for 10 years and can be extended for 4 more years, or a total of 14 years. A division bench of Justice D.Y. Chandrachud and Ajay Rastogi said denying permanent commission for women amounts to miscarriage of justice. It said that there cannot be gender discrimination in granting permanent commission to women officers in the Navy after the statutory bar was lifted by the Centre in 1992 to allow the entry of women in the Navy. Once the statutory bar was lifted to allow entry of women officers, then male and female officers are to be treated equally in granting permanent commission, the court said, rightly so. The bench rejected the centre's stand that women officers in the Navy can't be granted sea duties because Russian vessels don't have washrooms for them. There is enough documentary evidence to suggest women officers in Navy have brought accolades to the force, it's said. The verdict also grants pension benefits to women officers in the Navy who have retired prior to the date of the judgment and were not granted PC, while clarifying that pension benefits would not be available to those officers who retired after the date of the decision and those who had not opted for permanent commission, right? Now, guys, just remember one thing here, that the order that this judgment has come out on the 17th of March 2020. Now let's look at the questions that have been provided. 18 part 1. Sub-Lieutenant Arora is a women officer in the Indian Navy. She, along with Sub-Lieutenant Singh, a male officer, have served the same duration in the Navy, and both have applied for a PC. At the time of considering the application, the Chief of Naval Officer orders that Sub-Lieutenant Singh be granted a PC but not Sub-Lieutenant Arora, since he says that women do not have the physical capability to serve on the high sea and should not be away from their home for such long durations. In light of the Supreme Court judgment described in the passage above, is such an order valid? A. Yes, since the Chief of Naval Staff provided legitimate reasons for the decision. B is that yes, since the reasons provided by the Chief of Naval Staff are not explicitly covered in the judgment. C is that no, since the Navy should modify the Russian vessels to make them fit for use by women as necessary. D is that no, since the judgment provides that there can be no gender discrimination granting PC to women officers in the Navy. Guys, this is pretty clear cut. Answer in this is going to be D. This is exactly what the judgment says, that there can be no gender discrimination whatsoever. And the statement here made by the chief of naval staff, which says that women don't have the physical capability to serve at high seas and should not be away from their family for such long duration, is clearly, gender discrimination. It's as clear as it gets, right? So answer in this case is going to be D. 18 part 2. Two officers in Navy, one male and one female, will be considered for the grant of PC on March 28, 2020. Since there was at that time only one PC slot available in the Navy's quota, the supervising officer had to determine which of the two officers should be granted a PC. After considering all information at hand, the Chief of Naval Staff noted that the male supervisor had an impeccable service record, whereas the female officer had received certain adverse remarks for her handling of her responsibilities in the past and had not performed as well as the male officer. The Chief of Naval Staff therefore decides to recommend the PC to the male officer but not to the female officer. The female officer claims that this is violative of the Supreme Court judgment. Is she right? A is that yes, since the Chief of Naval Staff's recommendation was discriminatory against the female officer. B is that no, since the recommendation of the PC to the male officer over the female officer was not made on the basis of gender discrimination. C is that no, is that yes, since past conduct should not have been a factor in determining which officer was recommended for grant of PC. And D is that no, since the matter was entirely within the supervising officer's discretion, they could decide in it in any manner that they thought fit. Now, guys, in this case, the answer is going to be B, right? Since the recommendation of the PC to the male officer over the female officer is not made on the basis of gender discrimination. What has been written here, that he's considered all information at hand. He has said that that the male officer had impeccable service record. On the other hand, the female officer had received some adverse remarks for handling of a responsibility and not performed as well. Now, coming to what the passage says here, understand this, guys. It's clearly written here that the application for permanent commission be considered based on the availability of vacancies and recommendations of the Chief Naval Staff, and that there should not be any gender-based discrimination within that particular recommendation. And from the facts that have been made available to you, there is nothing indicative of this fact. Of course, this is it's very, very different to the previous case, wherein the guy had said wherein the chief lieutenant where the Chief of Naval Staff had said that women don't have the physical capability to serve on high seas, which in that case was clearly discriminatory on gender grounds, which is not the case here. Answer in this case is going to be B. Now, 18 part 3. Coming to question number 18 part 3, wherein it reads as follows. Lieutenant Commander Khanna has been serving in the Indian Navy on SSC since January 1st, 2010. She had decided not to opt for the PC. Until what date at the maximum can Lieutenant Commander Khanna serve as an officer in the Indian Navy? Option number A, December 31st, 2023. B is December 31st, 2019. C is is March 17, 2020, or D is permanently until retirement. Guys, in this case, the answer is clearly going to be A, December 31st, 2023. Why is this so, guys? If we look at the passage above, wherein it states that a permanent commission entitles an officer to serve in the Navy till he or she retires, unlike short service commission at SSC, which is the case in hand, wherein which is currently for 10 years and can be extended by 4 more years, or a total of 14 years. So total of 14 years for Lieutenant Commander Khanna from the time that she joined the army, which is December 31st, 2023 from January 1st, 2010. Right? Answer in this case is clearly A. 18 Part 4. Vice Admiral Joshi retired from the Indian Navy on March 22nd, 2020 with a distinguished service record under the course of her SSC. She had decided not to opt for PC and had thus retired at the end of a 14-year stint as an SSC officer in the Navy. Is she eligible for pension after retirement? A. Yes, since she had a distinguished service record. B. Yes, since she had served the full duration of her SSC. No is C, since she had not opted for the PC. And D is that no, since she had retired after the date of the Supreme Court judgment and had not opted for PC. Guys, in this case, answer is obviously D. It flows from the passage wherein itself we look at the last paragraph of the passage wherein it is clearly stated that the verdict also grants pension benefits to women officers in the Navy, yes, who have retired prior to the date of the judgment and were not granted PC, while clarifying that pension benefits would not be made available to officers who retired after the date of the decision and who had not opted for PC, right? Now, the judgment has come out on the 17th of March 2020. In this case, Vice Admiral Joshi has retired on March 22nd, which is after the date of the Supreme Court judgment, and she has also not opted for the PC, which is exactly what the law says, right? So the answer in this case is D. 18 Part 5. Lieutenant Gupta, a woman officer serving in the Indian Navy since March 1st, 2014, applied for and was granted PC on March 25th, 2020. Until what date at the maximum can she serve as an officer in the Navy? A is that until March 21st, 2030. B is until she attains the age of retirement. C is until March 24th, 2034. And D is that there is no maximum limit on her tenure and she could choose to serve until any date that she decides. Now, guys, it is clearly written here that the answer should be B, that is until she attains the age of retirement. Going back to the same part of the passage that I just read, wherein it states that a permanent commission entitles an officer to serve in the Navy till he or she retires. So in this case, she has been granted permanent commission, which allows her to serve the maximum, the date at the maximum until which she can serve as an officer in the Navy is the date of her retirement, right? So the answer in this case is B. Now, guys, coming to the last question that is been provided in the sample paper for the legal section. Question number 19. There's a popular myth often fostered by the police itself that the force requires orders from their superiors, that is the political executive, in order to act. In reality, under the law, the police have adequate powers and they do not need any orders from anybody, provided that they are aware of their powers and have the will to act. The second myth relates to the use of lethal force. The popular notion is that the police need special orders to open fire. Once again, it's not so. An unlawful assembly, popularly known as a mob or a riotous mob, has been defined in the Indian Penal Code, that's the IPC, in section 141, as an assembly of 5 or more persons, where the common objective of the persons composing that assembly is committing violence, or where such assembly of 5 or more persons is likely to cause a disturbance of the public peace. How exactly is the legal power of the police to use force vested in section 129 of the Code of Civil Criminal Procedure is to be used was prescribed in the case of Karam Singh versus Hardyal Singh and others. It is held that before any force can be used, there are 3 prerequisites that have to be satisfied. Firstly is that there should be an unlawful assembly. Secondly is that such assembly is ordered to be dispersed. And thirdly, in spite of such orders to disperse, the assembly should have refused to disperse. Thus, the police can never have any excuse for not acting or waiting for orders from their superiors or the political executive. It's a popular misconception that the police need an order from a magistrate in order to act. Section 129 of the CRPC speaks of any executive magistrate or officer in charge of a police station, or in the absence of such officer in charge, any police officer not below the rank of a sub-inspector. This means that any one of them can order the use of force to disperse an unlawful assembly. One often finds police officers taking a plea that while they did want to use force, the executive magistrate did not issue orders, even though the law does not say that only an executive magistrate can issue such an order. If there is an executive magistrate around, it's generally considered good practice to obtain his or her orders, but it's not stated anywhere that it is mandatory, right? So that brings an end to this passage. What are the questions? Question 19, part 1. Inspector Ishmeet is in charge of a team of 5 constables of the police entrusted with capturing the notorious gangster Varun Mowley, who has been on the run from the police for some time. He receives information that Mowley is hiding in a remote suburb of Mumbai and decides to take the local train to reach Mowley as soon as possible. The inspector and his team reach Dadar station to catch this train, but when they were there, platform is extremely crowded and they're not able to get through to the train. Inspector Ishmeet shouts loudly at the people on the platform, telling them to get out of the way, but nobody listens to him as it's rush hour and the people are keen to get to their workplace. Inspector Ishmeet opened fire to disperse the crowd. When he's pulled up by the authorities for doing so, he pleads that he was merely exercising his power under Section 129 of the CRPC. Is his argument valid? Now, guys, for the sake of clarity, they've also given that inspector ranks above a sub-inspector and a constable ranks below a sub-inspector of police. Option number A. No, since it would have been better for Inspector Ishmeet to take a police van to capture Mowley. B is that no, since the people on the platform did not constitute an unlawful assembly and the inspector did not have the authority to use force on them under 129. C is that yes, since by obstructing the police from catching the train, people on the platform constituted an unlawful assembly. And D is that since yes, since Inspector Ishmeet had told the people to disperse and he'd only use force once they had not dispersed. Guys, in this clearly the answer is going to be B, that the people on the platform do not constitute an unlawful assembly and the inspector did not have the authority to use force on them under Section 129 of the CRPC. Now, guys, why is this so? If we look at what is the definition of an unlawful assembly given in the passage itself, wherein it says that it's been defined under Section 144 of the IPC as an assembly of 5 or more people where the common objective of the person composing that assembly is committing violence, which is not the case here, or where such assembly of 5 or more persons likely to cause a disturbance of public peace, which again is not the case here. So it's very clear here that there's not an unlawful assembly. Now coming to the second part of option B, where it says that the inspector did not have the authority to use force on them under Section 129 of the CRPC. Now that has 3 requirements, right, that have to be satisfied under 129. One is that there has to be an unlawful assembly to begin with, right? Second is that it has to be ordered to be dispersed, and thirdly is that in spite of these orders to disperse, that particular assembly is refusing to disperse. Now, out of the 3 tests, at the very outset, only the first test is not met, that there is no unlawful assembly to begin with in this case, right? So he has no power vested under 129 to act in the way that he did. So as a result, guys, the answer is going to be B, that no, people on the platform did not constitute an unlawful assembly. Inspector did not have the authority to use force on them under 129. Therefore, the argument that he is merely exercising his powers under 129 is not valid. Now, question 19, part 2. Inspector Ishmeet and his team finally reach the location where Mowley is hiding, which is a park in a remote suburb. There they find Mowley talking to 2 of his associates and overhear them planning to rob a nearby bank. Inspector Ishmeet shouts out to Mowley and his associates, telling them to stand still and do not move. Okay, Mowley and his associates instead start running away from the spot, and Inspector Ishmeet and his team chase them and start hitting them with lathis. Once again, Inspector Ishmeet says that this was a valid exercise of his power under 129 of the CRPC. Which of the following are reasons as to why this was not? Guys, remember this. The question is why this was not a valid exercise of inspector's power under 129 of the CRPC. Option number A is that since Mowley and his associates were less than 5 in number, they did not constitute an unlawful assembly. B is that since Inspector Ishmeet had ordered Mowley and his associates to stand still rather than disperse, the requirements of 129 of the CRPC were not fulfilled. C is neither of A or B, and D is both A and B. Guys, answer in this is clearly going to be D, that is both A and B. Why is this so? Let's come to A. A says that since Mowley and his associates were less than 5 in number, they did not constitute an unlawful assembly. We know very clearly from what has been defined above in the passage itself under section 141 of the IPC, an unlawful assembly is an assembly of 5 or more people. In this case, what has happened, there's Mauli and the 2 of his associates. So there's 3 people, so obviously they're less than 5 in number, they don't constitute unlawful assembly, yes. Coming to the second part, wherein it states B, wherein it states that neither since Inspector Schmidt had ordered Mauli and his associates to stand still rather than disperse, the requirements of 129 of the CRPC were not fulfilled. As we've discussed, the requirements of 129 are threefold. First is that there has to be an unlawful assembly. B is that you have to give an order to the assembly to disperse, and the third part, and C is that in spite of the orders to disperse, they have not dispersed, right? In this case, what has happened? Has he told them to disperse? No, he has told them to stand still and not to move, which is, goes against the second test established under 129 as per the particular case that has been mentioned in the problem, right? So, guys, the answer here is clearly going to be both A and B. As a result of which, the answer here is D. Right? Question number 19, part 3. Mauli and his associates run away from the spot, and when Inspector Ishmeet's team finally catches up with them, 5 more of Mauli's associates had joined Mauli. The 8 of them were standing outside a local bank, armed with sticks and stones, and were breaking all the windows in the bank in an attempt to scare people and raid the bank. As Inspector Ishmeet was tired from chasing Mauli and his group and had stopped somewhere to rest, Head Constable Kumar was leading the police team, and he had ordered the team to start firing upon Mauli's group to stop them. Did he have the authority to do so? A is that no, since the constable does not have the authority to use force, order the use of force under section 129 of the CRPC. B is that no, since Mauli and his group did not constitute an unlawful assembly. C is that yes, since Mauli and his group's actions clearly showed that they were an unlawful assembly. And D is that yes, since Head Constable Kumar was leading the police team at that time. Now, guys, the answer clearly in this case is A, that no, since a constable does not have the authority to order the use of force under section 129 of the CRPC, which is what has happened in this case. Head Constable Kumar has ordered his team to start firing upon the group to stop them. Why is this so? Now, look at what section 129 clearly states, right? It states that any executive magistrate or officer in charge of a police station, or in the absence of such officer in charge, any police officer not below the rank of sub-inspector, right? This means that any one of them can order the use of force to disperse an unlawful assembly. This is from the last paragraph of the passage above. So it says that any police officer not below the rank of sub-inspector can order the use of force to disperse an unlawful assembly. It's critical here to remember that it's not below the rank of sub-inspector, and in the first part, 19 part 1, it's clearly written that a constable ranks below a sub-inspector of police. So as per section 129, a head constable did not have the power to order the use of force in this particular scenario, right? As a result of which, the answer in this case is going to be A. Right, so now 19 part 4 is that Inspector Ishmeet finally caught up with his team, managed to stop them just before they opened fire on Mauli and his associates. He then shouted at Mauli and his group to disperse, and when they did not, he tried to call out the local executive magistrate in order to obtain her order to use force on Mauli and his associates. Was it necessary for him to obtain the executive magistrate's order in that situation? A is that yes, since only an executive magistrate can order the use of force under section 129 of the CRPC. B is that no, since Head Constable Kumar had already issued the order to use force on Mauli and his associates, and there was no need for another order. C is that since Inspector Ishmeet had authority under section 129 to order the use of force to disperse an unlawful assembly. And D is that yes, since obtaining the permission of the executive magistrate in such situations is always more advisable. Guys, again, referring to the same part that we referred to in the previous question, look at the last paragraph here. It says any executive magistrate or an officer in charge of a police station, or in the absence of such officer in charge, any police officer not below the rank of a sub-inspector can order the use of force to disperse an unlawful assembly. This is under section 129 of the CRPC. In this case, an inspector is above the rank of sub-inspector, as a result of which he does have the power under 129 to order the use of force. He does not have to wait for an order from the executive magistrate, right? The answer in this case is going to be C. Now coming to the last one, when the executive magistrate 19.5, when the executive magistrate did not pick up Inspector Schmidt's call, he decided to take matters into his own hand. He shouted again at Mauli's group, telling them to disperse. This time, Mauli and his group got scared and ran away in different directions. Inspector Schmidt, however, was very keen to catch them, and he then ordered his team to start firing at them. Did he have authority to do so under Section 129 of the CRPC? A is that yes, since an inspector has the authority to order the use of force to disperse an unlawful assembly under Section 129 of the CRPC. B is that yes, since Mauli and his group did not listen to Inspector Schmidt's order to disperse the first time he shouted at them. C is that no, since Mauli and his group did not constitute an unlawful assembly, and D is that no, since Mauli and his group had dispersed in response to Inspector Schmidt's orders. Now, guys, again, like look at the three tests laid down under Section 129 of the CRPC as per the case of Karam Singh versus Hardayal Singh. Okay, first is that there has to be an unlawful assembly. Secondly is that there has to be an order made to the assembly to disperse, and the third one is the third one is if this such an order to disperse is not being followed, then on a satisfaction of all these three like requirements, can the officer in charge order for the use of force. Now, what is happening in this case, guys, it's very clear that he's given them an order to disperse, and they have dispersed, right? So the third test, which says that in spite of being given an order to disperse, the assembly still does not disperse, that test has not been satisfied, right? And for us, for like him to have the authority to like order the use of force under 129, all three tests have to be satisfied. The last test has not been satisfied in this case, right? As a result of which he did not have the authority to do so, because these people have actually dispersed, right? And yeah, as a result of which, guys, the answer is going to be D. No, since Mauli and his group had dispersed in response to Inspector Schmidt's orders. Now, guys, that brings an end to like the questions that have been discussed in the sample paper. Now, what are the takeaways from this particular sample paper with respect to the legal section that we have to do, right? The first takeaway, guys, is that again, there is no prerequisite knowledge that is required whatsoever, right? At the end of the day, this is just like any other reading comprehension. I mean, probably the only distinguishing factor that I find between the legal section and the English section is that there is a legal element attached to this particular section, and there's one more difference that I find is that it's a little more application based, right? In the sense that you have to apply to like a particular problem that they probably have given, like for example in the last set where they spoke of different situations, one wherein the head constable has applied force, whether that's fine, another where like does he have to wait for like he decided to wait for the executive magistrate's order, whether that was okay on his part to do. The fact that he asked them to disperse, they dispersed, and yet he opened fire, whether that was in accordance with the law. So there's a little bit of application on the basis of what has been provided, right? But then again, guys, at the end of the day, this is simply a reading comprehension, right? All the information that I had to answer probably the set of questions was there in that passage itself. Like for example, the three tests for section 129 was there. What is an unlawful assembly is there, right? All these things are already there. So simply like at the end of the day, it's proper reading comprehension. I have to be able to understand exactly what that passage is saying, and only on that basis of that information am I answering, right? So yeah, so that's one bit. So do not get worried, oh, I have to know this, I have to know what's an unlawful assembly and all of that. You don't have to know any of that, okay? You don't have to know anything prior to going into this examination with respect to like the law of the land and any of that, okay? Well, of course, it does like help to be well read. So I mean, which is why we emphasize on you like keeping up to date with all that's happening in the legal world, so that I mean, it helps. But it's not that any of it is necessary and relevant, right? To like you being able to successfully crack this examination, right? Now, the second takeaway, guys, is that now there were 7 sets of questions that we've done today, and 6 of them had like 5 questions each, and one of them has 7. So that's like 37 questions in total. Or like, I mean, it's a tough read, right? I mean, 7 sets which are a little complex, there's a lot of application of mind that's being involved. Okay, so it can get tricky, right? So you have to ensure that you are perfectly fine with like trying to like read so much information, right? Because there are like 7 sets here. Your English section has another couple sets of passages. Then your logic also has some passages. Then your GK also has some passages. There's a lot of reading involved, and this is something that I've been emphasizing on for like the longest time. You need to ensure that your reading speed is up to date so that your time is not really affected. Okay, so please ensure that you guys are practicing super hard, like trying to ensure that you finish all these papers within like a set time, that you have to decide what your goal is. That's on you. Like that, now nobody here at Chatterpool can be able to tell you how you, like what goals you have to set. Okay, we can only guide you, but at the end of the day you have to be like, okay fine, if I want to finish this in 35 minutes, this is how I'm going to go about it, right? So my point being that there's a lot of reading involved. 7 sets. After that, again, there's like scenarios that they provided. You have to think. There's a lot of reading involved, right? So you have to be like, your reading speed has to be like really good. Now, as you guys know, now this exam has been pushed by another 2 months to from today's date. It's now 2 months from now, sorry. So like June 21st is when this exam is happening, right? So you have to ensure that you use this coming 2 months to like ensure that your speed is up to the mark, right? And you're able to like solve all these questions with relative ease. Because I mean, if your reading speeded up to the mark, then you're not going to find much difficulty. We're not going to comment on like the difficulty level of this examination, whether it's going to be reflective of what this particular sample paper is saying. That's like, it's too early for us to make that call, and we can't say that in fact till the point that we actually see the paper, right? Till you guys actually appear for it to see what the difficulty level is. But do remember that this is the section which is the difference maker. If I'm not wrong, if I'm wrong, please do reach out to me and tell me that, okay, that I'm being wrong in this case. But our goal here is to ensure that we try to match this section, right? That's our goal. Like if there are 37 questions, we want to get 37, and it's very much doable. Like from the set of questions that we've seen here today, it is very much doable, provided that we are able to like use our time effectively, right? Use our time very well within the time prescribed for this examination, and go about this in a systematic fashion. That is only going to come if your reading speed is up to the mark. If you guys have no like issues with like trying of like finishing the paper in time, and only then, you know, like as you guys very well know, the margins in CLAT are extremely minimal. So that's on you guys. Please read, please like better your reading speed, because that, I mean, as per my opinion, that's going to be like the deal maker or breaker, as it may be. Now, with respect to today's class, I'm going to have a talk with Shresht. What we're most probably going to do is that in the event that you've not been able to understand any of the explanation that I've given to these questions that have been provided in the sample paper, we will probably have like a discussion class on that, or we'll be sending out a sheet and you can like quickly type out your answers and why you think your answer was the right answer, and then probably we can get into that, some sort of engagement from our side as to, okay, why is it that your answer is incorrect, and why is it that this is the particular answer, right? So we'll get into that. Don't worry about it. We will be solving all the queries that you possibly might have. But other than that, yeah, that brings an end to today's class, guys. Please stay in, stay safe. I hope everyone at home is also like safe and sound, and yeah, and good luck, and like study hard, prep hard, and remember all the things that we've spoken about today. And yeah, bye bye, see you.